That is Jagmeet Singh. He is the leader of the NDP, holding a press conference on Parliament Hill, announcing that his party and the Liberals have come to an agreement, a negotiated agreement on new legislation the Liberals plan to introduce on Monday around sick leave. Now, Mr. Singh says that the legislation, as agreed upon, would allow millions of Canadians to access more paid sick leave rather than thousands, though he would not provide more details or exact details on how that will work. He says it will happen quickly, that there is an agreement on a timeline for the legislation, 1 or 2 days, he said, though he didn't have an exact number. He said that his party would get back to reporters on that. Again, though, no details really on the legislation. We don't know exactly what it will look like. He said that we'll find out on Monday. But essentially, the big picture in all of this is that legislation, that agreement between the NDP and the Liberals, as Mr. Singh says, allows him, if it is exactly what they agreed to, if that's what's presented on Monday, allows the NDP to support the throne speech in a confidence vote, which ensures that there will not be an election, at least this fall, here in Canada. I want to get some more perspective, of course, on that throne speech, as well as what we just heard from two people who know a lot about what it takes to write one and what it takes to implement one, or the agenda set forth in one. John Manley was finance minister under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. He joins us from Rideau Lakes, Ontario. And Ralph Goodale was finance minister under Prime Minister Paul Martin. He's in Regina. Hello to both of you. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for your patience for that surprise press conference we weren't anticipating, but I'm so glad to have you both with us tonight. Mr. Goodale, I'll start with you. We just heard the NDP lay out that they've come to an agreement with the Liberals, and it is their support that will allow the throne speech to survive a confidence vote. Are you surprised at all that it's the NDP that's kind of the formal dance partner for the Liberals, or is this what you would have anticipated?
No, not particularly surprised. A minority parliament is what it is. And it's very clear if legislation is to pass and if the House is to function, there's got to be more than one party that's involved in the work because one party alone cannot do it. So you need a team. And the NDP had been indicating for quite some time that they had some specific items that they wanted to talk about. The other parties were more general in their condemnation or in their opposition to the government. The NDP were more precise and specific. And these two items, some changes in EI and the issue about paid sick leave, both of those have been on the agenda for quite some time. Indeed, it was Premier Horgan in British Columbia that first raised this issue in the early days of the pandemic. So not surprised at all. And similarly, having pretty well been able to anticipate this from the government's perspective, I would have thought the government, particularly the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister, would have left some negotiating room to be able to deal with these issues if they were to come up. And it was pretty obvious that something was going to come up.
Mr. Manley, what this does, kind of, as I said in the introduction, in the big picture, is mean that there's not going to be an election. It'd be very unlikely unless something changes on Monday, and the government will be able to proceed with the agenda that it laid out in the throne speech. What did you think of that throne speech? We had talked, the three of us, previous to it about what to expect. What did you think when you actually heard the agenda delivered?
Well, first, let me add one point to what Ralph has said.
Please do.
The brutal truth of it is the NDP can't have an election now. They can't afford to run one, and they would be in deep trouble if there was one that was held. So I think there was a lot of self-interest behind finding a resolution. I think that the government was pretty adroit in making sure that they left a little room that the NDP could claim a historic victory and save themselves from being annihilated. So I think that's part of what happened here. And so we can go on. You know, I think I might have, had I been asked, I'd have recommended to the government, instead of a long speech from the throne as it was, I'd have kept it very short and very concise. The things that Canadians are worried about now is how to get through this COVID crisis, and will they still be standing, whether they personally, their households, or their businesses, when this comes to an end. And I would have kept focused on those things. There are some things governments can do well, and they're doing them. They're protecting people against their loss of income. They're ensuring that businesses can still function, that employees have a connection to their employer through this. Those are all good things. And the other thing they need to do, and this is largely a provincial matter, is put more and more resources into testing, being available and quick in response so that people can have confidence to go about their lives. That's what I think the priorities needed to be.
It's interesting, Mr. Goodale, because when we first started talking about what we might anticipate from the throne speech, I think it was around the time that government was prorogued. And the trajectory of the virus at that time, everyone was kind of feeling like a recovery was closer than the acute part of the pandemic. And things have really changed in at least, 4 big provinces in this country. And you could certainly see that reflected, I think, in, as Mr. Manley lays out, what Canadians wanted to hear and really, I think, what they ended up concentrating on when they heard what they did in the throne speech. Whether there was too much in there or not isn't for me to say, but certainly that ended up, I think, focusing, like that's the most important thing, I think, to Canadians right now. What are you going to do to help me get through this, because it's still really not good?
Yes, and I think the priorities laid out in the throne speech clearly reflected what Canadians had been saying in that regard. Focus on first things first. Number one, as rapidly as possible, put all your resources into getting this pandemic under control. Do what is necessary to deal with the health issues. Do what is necessary to deal with those pressing economic issues, so people can keep their lives together. Make sure that your focus is on those urgent and emergency items that Canadians are particularly concerned about. I think having got the priorities right in the rhetoric of the throne speech, then some of the specifics were actually pretty attractive. The extension of the wage subsidy, for example, the extension of the small business loans program, the commitment to 1 million jobs, job training, the proposed upcoming investments in infrastructure and so forth. Those were things, I think, that were both attractive and made sense to Canadians. And then thirdly, the distinction around spending, where the government said in relation to those things that are emergency items, the essential measures, having Canadians' backs and making sure that Canadians get through this in the best possible way. That's where the phrase was used. This is not a time for austerity. The things that would not be permanent or add to or create a structural deficit, but there was still room in the throne speech for the aspirational items. And around those, the language on spending was about prudence, sustainability, reasonability, and so forth. And I think that made a logical package that a lot of Canadians could support.
Mr. Manley, I wanted to get your take on that as well. What did you think of that balance and of the idea that right now, spending on the pandemic, quote unquote, this is not the time for austerity, and the fact that there won't be a budget, that we're just going to see an update in the next few months?
Well, on the last point, I think it's premature to bring in a budget, because I don't think you can realistically predict what the revenue side of that will look like, nor can you really, because of all these programs, accurately predict what the expenditure side will look like. So I'm not sure what good a budget would do. You put a blindfold on and throw a dart at the wall and see what you get. But I'm not sure. Like, to suggest that this was as the speech from the throne did, that this is a binary proposition. We either spend everything we want, or you want austerity. To me, that's not the choice. I don't know anybody in this situation that's calling for austerity. And we just heard Mr. Singh say, this sick leave proposal, he wants it to be permanent. This isn't a special measure. The work that C.D. Howe Institute did, as I lead one of their working groups on fiscal sustainability, if we were to go back to the program spending level that existed prior to this and maintain that for 10 years, after all of these special programs come down, which is not this fiscal year, but the next one, you would still be running a deficit of $40 billion, and it would be adding up quickly. If you increase your spending at all, then you start to really project that deficit up into the stratosphere and your debt to GDP ratio with it. So, I'd like to think that there are all these people that made a killing on the pandemic and they're going to pay for this. But I don't know who they are. We used to have an old saying, I don't know if they used it when Ralph was at the Department of Finance, but the best taxation was don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that guy behind the tree. That guy isn't there. So we're gonna have to pay for this. And so making sure that we're prudent and careful is really part of the message that I would like to hear.
I just have time for one final question, and it's to you, Mr. Goodell, and it's actually on a different subject. Forgive me if you might not even be aware of this. It just crossed into my inbox. It actually has to do with your previous portfolio of public safety. If you haven't heard of it, just tell me. It's an interview. I've done a bunch of interviews with you at the time on an individual who was interviewed by Rukmini Kalamaki on her podcast. He was suspected of terrorist activities. Abu Hazaifa in Syria said in that podcast that he had traveled over there. He's been arrested by the RCMP for basically for faking it, for a hoax. Essentially, the charge is hoax-terrorist. I was just wondering if you had any reaction to it, because I remember asking you many questions at the time about whether or not the RCMP would be arresting this individual, if you were investigating it. Now it appears it was a hoax, according to the RCMP.
Well, I remember saying in the usual maybe oblique fashion of a minister of public safety that all things may not be as they appear to be, and that our police and security services were always doing what they need to do to keep Canadians safe. And I find it to be a very interesting development that now, apparently from what you've told me, this individual has been charged with a hoax. So those who lightly quote podcasts and various news sources might be well advised to check those sources before they quote them.
Okay. Thank you, Minister Goodell. I do remember you saying that. Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you, Mr. Goodell and Mr. Manley. Yes?
And I was particularly directing it at the opposition at the time.
Touche. Appreciate very much both of you spending some time on your Friday evening with us. Have a great weekend.
The proposed legislation will include paid sick leave that will help millions of Canadians. Today marks the first step in achieving the first ever in the history of our country federal paid sick leave for Canadian workers. And it's the first step towards our ultimate goal of ensuring all Canadian workers have paid sick leave from now and forever. So today is a historic moment where we have, in the first time ever in this country's history, established a federal paid sick leave.
NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh just last hour there claiming victory. His party and the minority Liberal government have struck a deal on expanding the paid sick leave provisions in what's known as Bill C-2. The bill was originally introduced yesterday. It would boost pandemic aid benefits. The Liberals needed the NDP to pass any legislation and a confidence vote on its throne speech. Let's get the power panel to weigh in on what that means. Freelance journalist Fatima Syed joins us from Toronto. In Montreal, Marty Patriquin, the Quebec correspondent for The Logic. Marie Vastel is a parliamentary correspondent for Le Devoir, and she's with us from just over the river in Gatineau. And here in Ottawa, Paul Wells is a senior writer for Maclean's. Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
Hi there.
Marie, let me start with you because it was an interesting press conference. It's clear that there's not going to be an election. Mr. Singh says that on Monday, if everything is exactly what they agreed to today, though he wouldn't disclose exactly what that is, other than more people will get paid sick leave, that they will support the Liberals' throne speech, which of course will face a vote of confidence, which will allow the Liberals to survive that vote and thereby avoid an election. Is this a win for the NDP or is it a win for the Liberals or maybe both?
Well, I think the NDP won partly. I don't think they won on this latest amendment. So I think they are correct to claim victory in the sense that what was supposed to replace the CERB initially would have been a little less money, $400 a week. And it has been boosted up to $500 a week. So it stays the same amount as the CERB. And that is a win in the sense that it never really made sense that it would go down starting this month. And the reason was never really explained. So I think the NDP did get a win on that. But on their second demand, which was 2 weeks of sick leave for every Canadian, well, we don't really know what they got. What I've been told from the language is that it would include people with pre-existing conditions that are more fragile if they get COVID. But it does remain sick leave only in the context of COVID. And the NDP was asking for until yesterday for universal health care, that perhaps you could take days, not just 1 week or 2 week blocks. They were concerned that there was no job protection. If someone took a sick day, would they lose their job? Someone with a more precarious job, obviously. That doesn't seem to be in it. So on the sick leave days, I feel like the NDP might be claiming victory when it's not really that big of a victory, but that's the great strategy when you remain very vague publicly about what you're asking for, as Mr. Singh did yesterday in that press conference. Then you can remain very vague on what you won, as he did in the press conference today, and no one really knows if you won or lose. And I think that was the NDP's strategy all along.
Yeah, Fatima Marie raises an interesting point, because the NDP had really been pushing for more permanent paid sick leave, right? Not just for the duration of the pandemic. We don't know exactly what is in the bill that will be reintroduced on Monday. Marie obviously has heard some stuff, but all that Mr. Singh would say is that millions of Canadians, not thousands, will have access to paid sick leave, but we don't know under what constraints, really, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a very tiny victory, if at all, because we're all awaiting details to understand what really happened. I think Mr. Singh has long time said that he would want to see a federal paid sick leave program, and he's considering this as a step towards that. But again, barring any details, we don't know what this looks like. I think many might sort of breathe a sigh of relief knowing that they might be getting paid sick leave even during COVID, considering the long testing lines that we've all been hearing about this week and in the weeks prior. So I am eagerly waiting for more information.
Marty, the funny part of all, I mean, I don't know if it's funny. It's funny to a political nerd like myself, and I'm going to call all of
We're
you.
all of
I was going to say that all of you are too, but
Let's own up
there
to
is
it.
no Liberal, either current.
I'm sitting in my basement right now. Yes,
I would normally be in mine as well. I just interviewed Ralph Goodale, who happened to be lined up before we even knew that Jagmeet Singh was going to be on. And even he right away was like, just want you to know, it was John Horgan who first asked for the sick leave. It wasn't Jagmeet Singh. Like, every Liberal you talk to, either on screen or off, is unwilling to give publicly Jagmeet Singh any credit for this. They say, oh, we're working with the NDP. They all make sure to highlight for every journalist who will listen, guys, this was John Horgan, the Premier of BC, who actually brought this up first. Don't give Jagmeet Singh any credit. It sort of speaks to a lot of the gamemanship that goes on behind the scenes around all of this stuff.
For sure. You see in this a little bit, almost the existential crisis that the NDP has been in forever. One of the reporters brought it up, is that there's a long history of the NDP propping up Liberal governments, and that's true. And we're in a scenario now where the Liberal government is in the process of out NDPing the NDP. They did it in 2015 when they blew the top of deficit spending, and that's basically what did Tom Mulcair, because Tom Mulcair wouldn't commit to deficit spending. The Liberals did what the NDP would normally do. They did just that.
Side note, remember when the deficit was 10, they were saying it'd be $10 billion?
And that was a big deal.
And that was like a huge, we were talking about it for days. Yeah.
That was great. Anyway, so at the end of what Mr. Singh said in that press conference was interesting. He said the bit about, he tacked on at the end of it because he felt like he had to sort of put on a fig leaf for a second. He's like, he wanted to make sure that he said that, that the cost of this, which we don't know because we're not going to say, shouldn't be borne by the middle class, shouldn't be borne by the business owners who bore the brunt of the pandemic, et cetera. It should be the wealthy who have actually profited from the pandemic. Guess what the Liberal government is trial ballooning right now? They are trial ballooning a wealth tax and an estate tax, two things that Mr. Singh brought up today. I don't know where the NDP is going to have ideological space at the end of all of this.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, one I posed to David Cochrane. I agree with you. I don't know what to think. Paul, maybe you have a crystal ball that is much more clear than mine. But you have to wonder, right? I think right now the NDP is resonating with Canadians. They do see the way that Mr. Singh, for example, reacts to things that are going on. He's always driving the story back to how Canadians are impacted by what's going on, that he's, there to fight for Canadians rather than sort of talk about the politics of things. I get that. I think they are resonating. But in the long term, does it do what Marty just explained, which is sort of further kind of coalesce the two parties in the minds of voters, leaving less room for the NDP ultimately when people are casting their ballots?
I mean, it's interesting. Jagmeet Singh is being quite careful to always present himself as the champion of the general working Canadian. He's picking these fights on economic grounds, not on questions like systemic racism or LGBTQ issues or the sort of woke stuff that a lot of people thought he would be trying to pick as his battleground. And he's trying to present himself as a pragmatist, right? The Conservatives are always voting no. The Bloc wavers kind of randomly, but the NDP seeks and gets advantages that ordinary Canadians can feel. I mean, in that, he resembles a previous NDP leader. I happen to have the cover of Maclean's from 15 years ago. Wow. That's Jack Layton there. And the question is, who is this man and why is he running the country? We got in a lot of trouble because people thought that he looked like Lenin in that photo.
Oh,
but that was the photo that's what Jack Layton looked like when he looked to his left. But it was the same technique then. A Liberal minority government, an NDP leader who was seeking to position himself as somebody who could get you stuff in that context rather than as somebody who fought for fighting's sake. We'll see whether it works out both for the NDP as well as it did for Layton and for the Liberals as bad as it did for Paul Martin.
Do you just happen to have like all the Maclean's covers sitting next to you when you're doing?
I have my phone and a printer nearby, and the Maclean's Archives is a fantastic free resource.
It sure is. Marie, it also kind of resets the table now heading into, we've had a couple days of the new fall session. We were, talking about the potential for an election a few weeks ago. Obviously, things with COVID have changed, but even as far as Parliament goes, what we have now is probably some stability for a little while that does allow the government now to start doing stuff that it laid out in the throne speech. What do you anticipate that means in a more practical sense?
Well, I did get the sense from the throne speech, yes, when they mentioned that fiscal update would be coming up in the fall. I forget the exact wording, but where they said there would also be new measures implemented from the throne speech. So it does sound like now that, as you say, they have stability, perhaps that fiscal update will be able to almost be like a mini budget where they will start to implement some of the things that they have promised, because there is stability, but they're still on quite a bit of a clock. It's a minority government. It's not going to last 4 years, let's be honest. And so they had a lot of ambitious things that they were saying they wanted to accelerate or get started. Those things have been put already on the back burner because of COVID. They haven't been able to do much of what they promised during the campaign because of COVID. Yeah. That needs to be brought back to the forefront if they don't want to be told during the whole next campaign that they didn't do anything that they promised. So they have to get that back on, and a lot of the things that they promised to accelerate in the throne speech. So I do expect that perhaps they're thinking, okay, we have a few months now of stability. Let's get everything we can out while we can, because I don't think people will be as agreeable when there's more confidence votes, when there's a budget in the spring. I have always thought that if they were to fall, it would be in the spring, not in the fall. And now it looks like that's a more probable scenario. But for sure, they don't have 2 years ahead of them.
You bring up a great point, though, and Fatima, I'd love to get your take on it as well, just on the juggling that the Liberals will likely have to do now that didn't exist for the last 6 months because they were able to say, we can't do anything else other than deal with this pandemic. I mean, there's a ton of stuff in this throne speech that even was in the last throne speech. Items like, for example, introducing UNDRIP legislation by the end of the year, responding to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, creating 1 million jobs. There are very big things that they're promising in this throne speech. aside from the response from the pandemic. But the pandemic is still kind of alive and well, obviously, as we were just talking to doctors about in certain provinces in this country. Do you think, how big of a challenge do you think it will be to actually do both? How likely do you think it is?
Oh, it's a huge challenge, and I don't see it happening very easily. I think today was like a very slight reprieve where they realized they have some breathing room to actually figure out how to do all the things they've promised on Wednesday. But they're fighting battles on so many fronts. The provinces aren't happy by the fact that, the healthcare sort of ask that they had wanted to see in the speech wasn't included. Doctors are still looking for a plan. You have, workers still asking for benefits and needing more support as the pandemic goes into a second wave. How they're going to navigate all those battles and deliver everything they've included, which is extremely ambitious, and it's going to be extremely challenging.
Marty, what do you think about that? Are they going to be able to do any of the other stuff?
I think it's all a factor of time. Look, I maintain I'm a little more optimistic for the Liberals. Look, I think they have a certain amount of runway just because how much of the oxygen is being occupied by COVID. Nobody else is thinking about anything. They can say anything that they want and be like, well, we want to do this, but look what's going on outside right now. I'm living in a province where I'm not allowed to have friends in my backyard right now for the first time in 3 or 4 months. Schools are closing down, that kind of thing. When you're still in that very, very acute stage of this virus, which we are, unbelievably, it covers a lot of sin and it gets away with a lot of what the government can, as they say in French, marge de manœuvre, as far as what they can do. So, I mean, it's very nice to have a throne speech, but a lot of it is just sort of decorum, is the sake of having a throne speech because you want to have a sense of normalcy, that kind of thing. But necessarily living up to it, I think it's more elastic now than it would be in normal times.
So what do you think, Paul, about how the next few months will compare to the previous few months? And by that, I mean, is it just, focus completely on the pandemic and how the government gets people through it? Or is there a little bit more kind of future think or future action? Or does that depend, I guess, on the trajectory of the virus?
I think the Canadian government, like any government of a large country, is going to have just a hell of a lot of issues that they're going to have to try and deal with. It won't be just only COVID, but COVID and the preoccupation that so many families have for how they're going to stay safe is going to be a shadow over all that other business. And I think the Trudeau government is going to be in the future the Trudeau government we've had so far. Sure, of a special vocation that makes it different from all other governments, but mired in the day-to-day crud that any government has to face, and trying hard to reconcile its spectacular self-image with dreary reality.
Do you think they're safe for a while, as Marty said?
Oh yeah, nobody wants an election.
And on
except
that,
us.
except for us. I wouldn't say I want an election.
Don't want one.
Yeah, no, I'll defer to Canadians on that one. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our power panel tonight. Really appreciate the discussion. Fatima Syed, Marty Patriquin, Marie Vastel, and Paul Wells. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.